Hello, this is Crystal Racing here, doing a special video where I will give my opinion on which team had the best driver lineup in Formula 1 in every season since 1950. Starting off with 1950. Alfa Romeo, who had Juan Manuel Fangio, Giuseppe Farina and Luigi Faguli driving for them that season. Ferrari had an okay driver lineup with Roberto Ascari, Luigi Villaresi, and I think Jose Froden Gonzalez driving a few races, but Alfa Romeo clearly had the best lineup in the whole field. 1951, Alfa Romeo yet again. Although I will say Giuseppe Farina's performances were a bit of a letdown this year, and I have to say Ferrari did improve a considerable amount, with Ascari challenging Fangio for the championship and Gonzalez winning Ferrari's maiden Grand Prix win at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, but Alfa Romeo still edge it for me. 1952 and 1953, Ferrari. Their lineup of Ascari, Giuseppe Farina, Taruffi, Villaresi and Mike Hawthorne delivered the goods for Ferrari in these two dazzling years where Alberto Ascari won a combined total of nine consecutive races, excluding the Indy 500. Mike Hawthorne won his maiden Grand Prix win at the French Grand Prix, and while all in this time, Alfa Romeo pulled out of Formula 1. Fangio was forced to miss out on 1952 due to an injured neck. And when he did come back, his Maserati team were not really strong enough. 1954, Ferrari again, but this time with Ascari having left the team to go to Lancia. They had Mike Hawthorne, Jose Froden Gonzalez, and Maurice Trinidad. Fangio did win the title, doing one half of the year with Maserati and Mercedes, but neither of those teams had particularly great backup drivers, and it was mostly due to the brilliance of Fangio that he won his second world title that year. 1955 Mercedes, Fangio, Sterling Moss and Cole Kling. Fangio and Moss were by far the best driver pairing on the grid that year. It doesn't even come close. There is no argument about it. Although, of course, this season was most infamous for the fact that 4 races were cancelled due to the tragedy at that year's 24 Hours in Le Mans when Pierre Levere collided with Mike Hawthorne and killed himself and 90 of the spectators in a horrific crash that almost killed motorsport off, but luckily motorsport survived that incident. 1956 Ferrari, Juan Manuel Fangio, Eugene Castellotti and Peter Collins were by far the strongest pairing on the grid. The Maserati team Sterling drove for just were decent, but he didn't really have any decent backup teammates that year. 1957 and 1958, Van Voort, Sterling Moss, Tony Brooks and Stewart Lewis Evans were a very, very strong driver lineup. Of course, Moss and Brooks won many races, particularly during 1958, but of course the Maserati team Fangio drove for didn't really have any strong backup drivers. Now I will say though, Ferrari do deserve a shout out because Hawthorne, Collins and Luigi Musso were also a strong team, but I just think Moss and Brooks edged them just slightly in terms of quality. 1959, the Rob Walker team using Cooper Climax chassis and engines. This is, of course, for those wondering, the only independent team included on this list. Sterling Moss and Maurice Trinidad, in my opinion, were the best driver lineup on the grid that year. For me, I think the sheer talent of Sterling Moss is enough to edge out Cooper's lineup of Brabham McLaren. 1960, Cooper's driver lineup of Brabham and McLaren were the strongest on the grid. I think at this point, Maurice Trinidad left Rob Walker's team, meaning that Sterling Moss was left with a few youngsters as his teammate, and of course Sterling Moss broke his leg at the Belgian Grand Prix on a day where I think 2 other drivers got killed. Very, very sad day for motorsport then, but of course Cooper and Brabham won their second consecutive titles that year. 1961, BRM, Tony Brooks and Graham Hill were the strongest lineup on the grid. Ferrari were more or less the team who ran away with the championship, both championships that year, with their lineup of Phil Hill and Wolfgang von Trips, but in all honesty, they were probably arguably one of the weakest driver lineups to ever win the drivers and the constructors championship, in my opinion. This was Tony Brooks' final year of Formula One. He ended his career at the US Grand Prix with a podium and subsequently retired at the age of 29. He had won 7 F1 races during his career, but it was a case of real bad timing, as of course Graham Hill and BRM went on to win both titles in 1962. 1962, Porsche, Dan Gurney and Joe Bonnier. Now, in terms of relative strength, this is arguably one of the weaker driver lineups in this whole list, partly due to the fact that Joe Bonnier was mostly a journeyman, but Dan Gurney was a fantastic talent. A driver who was capable of destroying the field. The only driver Jim Clark truly feared. Dan Gurney won 4 races in an F1 career, but arguably could have won so much more. And he also won the 24-hour Le Mans with, of course, the legendary AJ Foyt in the 4GT. 1960, and of course, in terms of special mentions, of course, Ferrari's lineup in 1959 had, of course, Phil Hill, Tony Brooks and Cliff Allison. Of course, Tony Brooks nearly won the driver's title that year, but lost out narrowly to Jack Brabham that year. 1963 and 64, Brabham, of course, ran by, of course, driver manager Jack Brabham, who had left Cooper because he felt like he couldn't win another world title there and he didn't have the money, so he decided to set up his own team, and he had Dan Gurney as his teammate. But of course, with the team in their early stages, their cars were fast but unreliable, and he didn't win a race. But for me, Jack Brabham and Dan Gurney were clearly the strongest lineup on the whole grid for those 2 years. Because of course Jim Clark didn't really have a strong teammate during his early years at Lotus, and Graham Hill likewise also had a lot of very weak teammates alongside him at BRM. 1965, Graham Hill and Jackie Stewart at BRM. Jackie Stewart was a rookie, but he pushed Graham Hill very hard that year. Graham Hill challenged Jim Clark for the title, but of course Jim Clark won 7 out of 10 races. Of course, Jackie Stewart won his maiden Grand Prix win at the season-ending Italian Grand Prix, having a fantastic draw with his teammate, and won and proved his talent by winning the race. Special mentions go out to, of course, Cooper's lineup of Bruce McLaren and Jochen Rindt. But of course, Jochen Rindt was a rookie, and Bruce McLaren was very good, but arguably not as good as Graham Hill or Jackie Stewart. 1966, Cooper, Jochen Rindt and John Surtees. 1964, champion John Surtees, also a former MotoGP champion, and left Ferrari and went to Cooper, but Cooper were not able to provide Rindt or Surtees a good enough car to fight for the championship. Of course, the championship that year and the next year were won by Brabham. Of course, won the world title in 66, and his teammate Denny Hulme won the title in 1967. 1967, Lotus, Graham Hill and Jim Clark. This was a proper superstar lineup. But of course, Jim Clark won 4 races. Graham Hill had all sorts of mechanical issues. Of course, the Lotus team were using the brand new Ford Cosworth DFB engine, which of course would go on to win many races and world championships until at least 1982. 1960, and of course a special mention goes to Cooper yet again, who of course Jochen Rindt was now joined by Pedro Rodriguez, who of course took the place of Bruce McLaren, who had left to go and create his own self-branded McLaren team. 1968, Jack Brabham and Jochen Rindt were arguably the strongest driver on the grid, of course, but the car was too unreliable and not as quick as the Matra Ford of Jackie Stewart or the Lotus Ford of Graham Hill. And as it was, Brabham finished all the way down in 8th place in a car that just simply just wasn't, despite having won the title in consecutive seasons, it's just they just fell behind everyone in the development race, and of course the BT24 and the BT26 just seemed to have just had far too many reliability issues, despite an attempt to use space frame tubing to adapt the chassis, but it just simply wasn't meant to be in that year. And then, of course, 1969, Lotus with Graham Hill and Jochen Rindt. Once again, Jochen Rindt comes onto this list for a third time on this list. Honestly, Jochen Rindt is arguably one of the sport's most underrated world champions due to his premature death. Lotus did, due to many mechanical issues, only finished down in third place, but with Jochen Rindt behind the wheel, they picked up 5 pole positions, but Jochen Rindt took until the US Grand Prix to finally take his maiden Grand Prix win in F1, whilst Graham Hill, at the age of 40, was clearly now past his best, but for me, he was still a far better backup driver. With him along, Lotus still had a fairly potent driver lineup. Of course, McLaren also had Bruce McLaren and Denny Holm, but I think... and then, of course, Brabham themselves also had Jack Brabham and Jackie Hicks. Now, I know this might be a bit controversial. I know some people might pick one of those two over the Lotus lineup due to how old, due to the fact that Graham Hill was getting old at this point. But for me, Lotus had the best lineup, mostly due to how good Jochen Rindt was this year. 1970 and 1971, Ferrari, Jackie Hicks and Clay Regazzoni, 2 young drivers who drove the wheels of the Ferrari and were arguably unlucky not to win a championship in either the drivers or the constructors championship in both seasons, partly due to the brilliance of Jochen Rindt, who was tragically killed at the Italian Grand Prix and became the sport's only posthumous champion today, and of course Jackie Stewart, who dominated 1971. Of course, Jochen Rindt had John Moores as a teammate. John Moores really let the team really wasn't good enough for Lotus or frankly F1 in general. And of course, Jackie Stewart had a young Francois Sever as a teammate, who I just think kind of just wasn't meant that Ferrari for 71 just about had the best driver lineup, but for 1972, however, Tyrrell, in my opinion, did have the best outright driver lineup with Jackie Stewart and Francois Sever. I know Jackie Stewart's championship hope went astray that year due to the fact he picked up an ulcer and he was forced to miss out the Belgian Grand Prix that year. And Emerson Fittipaldi pit Top Gear, and of course the Lotus 72 chassis was optimised fully to its full capabilities. But of course Emerson Fittipaldi had a teammate for that year, David Walker, who had just graduated from Formula 3, was an absolute disaster. Just didn't score a single point. It was definitely the best car on the grid that year, but he didn't score a point, and a lot of it was down to the fact that apparently he was overweight, he wasn't professional, he smoked and drank too much. Francois Sever had an average season, but for me, though, when you kept looking at a lot of the driver lineups up and down the grid, you could probably give a shout out to McLaren, who had Denny Holm and Peter Rebson as a teammate partnership. But I just think Tyrrell do edge McLaren out just a bit, to be honest. Since, of course, Denny Holm was mostly known for his being a steady Eddie, and Peter Rebson was very hit and miss in his driving. I mean, he did pick up 4 podiums that year, but he also missed out 3 races for, I'm not even sure why he missed out 3 races, but due to, of course, one of the limits of my F1 knowledge. 1973, Lotus, Ronnie Peterson and Emerson Fittipaldi were by far the strongest driver lineup on the grid. They won a combined total of 7 races together, and a combined total of 10 pole positions, 9 of whom went to Ronnie Peterson, but Jackie Stewart's consistency and experience edged him ahead of both the Lotus pairing. Of course, as it was, I mean, Fittipaldi was the better driver in the start of the season. Peterson came alive in the second half, but Stewart took advantage of the two Lotus drivers taking points off each other to win his third and final World Championship. But tragically, though, as we all know, Francois Sauveur was killed in practice for the American Grand Prix at the end of that season, meaning that Jackie Stewart was decided to withdraw from what would have been his 100th and final Grand Prix start at the end of that year. And Tyrrell were forced to find a new driver lineup for 1974. But, of course, in my opinion, though, in 1974, 75, 76, they had the strongest driver lineup pairing in Jody Scheckter and Patrick Depailler. But, of course, as we all know, the car arguably just wasn't quite good enough at this point. It does seem as if by the mid-70s, Tyrrell had dropped behind in terms of car development. In 74, they picked up 2 victories with Scheckter. They won again, another race again with Scheckter in 75. And then, of course, in 76, Scheckter won in the 6th wheel, Tyrrell, the P34. But, of course, at this point, Ferrari and McLaren had completely overtaken them, despite the fact that Fittipaldi, James Hunt and Niki Lauda had a pair of relatively weak number 2 drivers to back them up, with Jochen Mass and Clay Regazzoni, who for me kind of held Ferrari and McLaren back a little bit. But Ferrari won the Constructors' title in 75 and 76, in spite of the fact, of course, Niki Lauda suffered that horrific crash at the Nürburgring. 1977, Ferrari had the strongest driver lineup with Reutemann and Niki Lauda. Niki Lauda was, after his crash at the Nürburgring, pulled off an incredibly brilliant championship win in 1977. He only won 3 times, but he picked up 6 second-place finishes and a third-place finish at Brazil to win his second World Championship, and he won it with 2 races ago and decided to withdraw from Canada and Japan due to the fact that he had no interest in driving for Ferrari anymore. McLaren kept on Jochen Mass along with James Hunt, despite the fact Jochen Mass really wasn't that good a driver. Lotus had a decent lineup with Mario Andretti and Gunnar Nielsen. Of course, Gunnar Nielsen was forced to retire from Formula 1 after this year due to being diagnosed with cancer, which he would tragically die from. 1978, Brabham, Niki Lauda and John Watson. Very good driver lineup, I will say. But of course, Brabham did come up with a fan car for 1978, the Swedish Grand Prix, but it was of course later banned when Niki Lauda won by half a minute. And of course, there were many who speculated Niki Lauda was actually driving within the limits of the car due to the fact that they didn't want to make it so suspicious of how fast that car was. 1979, Brabham once again had the strongest driver lineup with Niki Lauda and Nelson Piquet, but due to fact they kept on with the Alfa Romeo engines, they had fallen way behind everyone due to the fact that everyone was now developing ground effect cars, and he finished down in 8th place in the championship. It meant that Niki Lauda decided to quit F1 with 2 races ago at the end of the year, deciding he was just bored to death, despite the fact that the new Ford powered chassis was actually turned out to be pretty good in the hands of Nelson Piquet in the next 2 years. 1980, Williams' lineup of Alan Joseph, Carlos Reutemann was arguably the strongest on the grid. A shout out has to be given to McLaren for the fact they had Alan Prost and John Watson as a driver lineup, and of course Ligier, who had Didier Pironi and Jacques Lafitte. But Williams arguably, in my opinion, had the best lineup that year. 1981. Renault, Prost and Arnoux, in my opinion, were the best lineup on the grid. Compared, of course, Williams were. Alan Jones was beginning to deteriorate slightly at this point. Brabham was had Nelson Piquet, but nope, they had a hard time finding a decent number 2 alongside him. Going, wasting time with Hector Abarki and of course Riccardo Sonino in those 2 years. And Ferrari's lineup, well, of course, Jody Scheckter was getting old and Jules Villeneuve was very inconsistent. They replaced Scheckter with Pironi, but Pironi struggled in 81, so it's going to be Renault for me. 1982, it's got to be McLaren. And 1983, once again, McLaren, their lineup of Lauda and Watson were not the fastest, but they were the most consistent. Williams had replaced their lineup of Joseph Reutemann with Keke Rosberg, but they had a hard time finding a decent number 2 driver, going from Mario Andretti, Carlos Reutemann, Derek Daly, Jack Lafitte, but none of them really did a good job in the number 2 seat at Williams. Ferrari, of course, saw both their drivers, Jules Villeneuve get killed, and of course did Pironi end his career with his legs being broken at Hockenheim, and then of course they replaced him with Rennie Arnoux and Patrick Tambay. But whilst they did win the Constructors' title in 82 and 83, that was arguably due to how fast the Ferrari was more than how good their drivers were. And of course, Brabham, once again, whilst they did replace they did find Riccardo Patrese pair to line him up alongside Nelson Piquet. Riccardo Patrese was not very consistent as number 2, it has to be said. So, and of course, in 83, Renault replaced Rennie Arnoux with Benny Cheever, who was just bang average. So for me, McLaren take the award for 82 and 83 with the best driver lineup. 1984, McLaren win it for a 3rd year in a row, but this time Adam Prost replaced John Watson, and it was it's not even a contest at this point. Although I will give a shout out to Tiro's partnership of Stefan Belov and Martin Brundle, who were arguably one of the strongest rookie lineups on the grid, taking Martin Brundle taking a podium at Detroit and Stefan Belov taking a podium at Monaco in a race he could have won had it not been red flag 30 laps early. But of course, later on in the year, the car was disqualified for using lead balls in the fuel tank, and of course all their results were rescinded. They were fined a huge amount of money, and they were pretty fortunate not to be kicked out of motor racing altogether for that season. 1985, it is Lotus, Elio De Angelis and Ayrton Senna. Ayrton Senna gave Elio De Angelis a massive headache that year, and at the end of that season, Elio decided he had enough and decided to move to Brabham. Tragically, though, of course, in 1986, Elio was killed in a testing crash for Brabham. But for me, I will give a shout out to Williams for 1985, who had a lineup of Keke Rosberg and Nigel Mansell. Nigel Mansell was quite inconsistent, but towards the end of the year, he really began to show his true class. Niki Lauda at McLaren was beginning to obviously deteriorate. At this point, he had loads of mechanical issues, but of course, by this point, his qualifying speed was completely gone. Was that Ferrari, of course, they had a lineup of Michele Alboreto and Stefan Johansson. Decent lineup, but not really the best. And of course, I've now talked for about 24 minutes. I think I'm going to have to declare this as part 1 of my best driver lineup every season award since 1950. There will be a part 2 because I have been talking for far too long. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe to Crystal Racing. I will see you again next time.